So this is, what our plans are for the remainder of this year and next year. This year we did we're doing 2 releases this year, or you can think of it as we actually moved the one towards the end of last year out. And I'm going to go over the new modules. Basically, what we're doing is moving tables that used to be, or files that used to be on in the folder, into SQL tables in a database. The database is still Access, but the tables are getting converted to where they're in a relational database format, so we can use them for things like speeding up reporting and the web API we're working on for MASA. So the ones in green on this slide are the ones that were in 11.4. The ones that are in the kind of blue, teal, whatever you want to call it, are the ones that are coming in 11.5. And there's more of them on the next page. The way these were selected is they're the files that we need in the database for various reports and the web API. The ones that are in black, we're not converting, in the sense that the files will remain as files on your file server. They're not going to be placed into any database at this time. As I said, we're moving them to get them into SQL tables. One of the things that lets us do is remove the size limits. So there's no limits on some of the files, or now tables in 11.4. So you, for example, can have as many centers as you want. I think we're all familiar with where we get things that are referring to stuff that isn't there anymore. With it in the database tables, we can use better cross-referencing to where we can't get ourselves into those situations. And it'll help us with better report performance and make the data usable by the web API. The other thing is that we're taking the opportunity as we move these files into tables to make the design extensible, so it's easier to add things in the future. So for example, chemical feeds, etc., are all supplies, and we'll work on the internal logic over the time so that it's possible to add a new supply without having to rework a lot of code. Same way project and groups are example of cost accounting jobs. And so there will be a job table in 11.5 that you can extend with additional kinds of jobs. Again, the code is still focused on only 2, but over time we'll be able to make it more generic. One of the new things is the deleted row functionality. In order to make sure that we don't drop any cross-references, we don't actually delete rows from the tables. They work like deleted files in Windows. They're still there, even though you don't see them. One of the thing in green we added after your 11.4 release, because of how the internal IDs work, the alternate IDs as we call them, you can't get the linkage back just by adding something with the same ID, because it gets a different alternate ID. So if you delete a center and you want to restore the center, you have to restore the deleted row. So there's now a screen. You can see the deleted rows and restore them if you didn't intend to delete something. But the deleted column that we use to track that's an integer, so you can have as many deleted of the same ID as you want. I'm not sure why you would do it, but essentially if you find yourself with some process where you always want to rename your center to something, you can before you delete it and just keep on reusing a name. But the references internally will be to the distinct centers. So it's not something I'd advise unless um, you're good at remembering what centers you were using when. Eventually we'll have to purge deleted rows from the database so they don't waste space. We figure that'll be probably an annual kind of activity. Maybe we may include it in the database upgrade process going forward. So right now there is no purge, so the data continues to accumulate. In order to make the changes we needed to into the tables, we have the new setup UI. You've probably noticed the screens look a little different. They have a toolbar across the top. We intended for them to have the same functionality as the existing VB6 forms, but we're after the release have added some things. We added the restore the deleted rows functionality. You can now do Control X to delete a row or a section or selection. And we're working on adding back in the missing F11 copy to clipboard and exporting to an Excel worksheet. The capability didn't work well enough to use the export from the reporting tool. You can take a report and save it in Excel, but the columns are not what you would like if you want to use that Excel spreadsheet to move data around. So we're going to bring back the old export format. We're very interested in your requests on the user interface, things we can do to improve it. But we can't do much if what we get is I can't use my keyboard like I used to. We need something specific like the Control X to delete a row or whatever, but it's not our intention to have made it harder to use. So if there's some flaws and stuff in it that we can work on, please let us know. The other thing is that the UI is likely, the changes are likely to be limited to those screens. I don't really expect it to go beyond what you see in 11.4 and 11.5, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But I think those screens we did as part of plans that were started 2 years ago, and as things change, it's looking more and more like that technology is just gonna stay where it's at for now. But as I said, I'll get into it. So our release plan is here. We're gonna have a fourth quarter release, 11.5, that's gonna have the additional changes to the setup files. There's also going to be a MASA only functionality in the fourth quarter for the MASA web API, and some of the work we've been doing on SQL Server will be incorporated to that in the cloud. Everyone will still be using the current access and what I call flat files, regular files in the file system on their local system, but the web API software in the cloud will be using SQL Server. We are going to release a .NET version of Transaction Plus in the second quarter of 2021. That's the plan. We've got a third party doing basically a line for line translation from VB6 into .NET. So we're not expecting any changes per se. The screens will look the same way and they'll still use the same files they use and so on. So we're not really getting any functional changes, hopefully. I say hopefully because the most likely functional change is something doesn't function. but the function basically should be what it is now. But it will get us onto .NET, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And then in 11.7, we're also going to do a second release in 2021. And we're going to add in crop audit, smart feeder, and lifecycle budget if we don't manage to fit lifecycle budget in earlier. In 2022, there'll be an 11.8 release. The .NET platform's evolving, and we, at that point in time, should be ready to go ahead and hop on the current version, which will be .NET 6 on Microsoft's plan. And we'll also look at introducing the local SQL Server for our MASA customers. I want to talk a little bit about the Web API, which may interest some folks, as you might have use for the functionality. What we're doing on the local system, this dedicated server, which is either on a campus where you're at today, or it's at your location. You're running the current system, which is a mixture of .NET modules and VB6 modules. And you're using an access database for the SQL tables. We're going to have a DB sync process that copies data back and forth between access on the local server up into the SQL Server database on the cloud. The reason for doing that is that we can make the data available in a web API. And the technology we're using underneath it is called OData. And the reason that's important is because tools like Microsoft Excel and Power BI understand OData. So if you point them with a URL like you'd put in the top of your browser at a specific URL, those tools can find out what tables there are in the SQL Server and import that data. And there are third-party reporting tools you might want to use as well. And if they understand OData, they can interact with the SQL Server. Also, we're looking at working with vendors to help them use our web API so that you can import and export data into the SQL Server. And then the sync process would bring data that you imported back down. And I shouldn't say you imported, it would be someone else's application that is pushing data across the web into this database using the web API. But for our first release, we're really focused on someone retrieving data from the web API. Say it's a Cropzilla that wants to be able to download updated cost data, or it's a granular or service that also needs actual costs in order to do some of the things their systems do. So there's various things we can do. In the initial release, we're also limiting the focus to data that's in Transaction Plus, but that doesn't mean that you're not able to get information about your feed purchases or your grain purchases. It just means that the actual activity costing tables aren't part of the target. So, any questions so far? Okay. Where are we headed? I had fun with this slide because I'm not a big cloud UI technology person. I thought the cloud was a big step backwards about 15, 20 years ago compared to desktop applications at the time. But I have to concede that probably the best user interfaces have become the ones in the cloud, and they're as good or better than desktop interfaces at this point. The other thing is that the technology is becoming uh, web-centric, even if it's on the desktop. So for example, if you're running Microsoft 365 and you're using an add-in with their new technology, that add-in actually works across the cloud. This picture here is Microsoft's how you would do it for the developers. So, and they want you to use the cloud technologies, the HTML, the cascading style sheets, JavaScript, to do your user interface. It's gotten, those have become so ubiquitous that even what you would think of a desktop app, such as something like Slack, which is an application we use, even though you install it on the desktop, it's actually running a little server on your desktop, and it's actually working like a cloud application internally. And Microsoft has gotten into that as well, so that one of their developer tools, which is pretty popular right now because it runs across platforms, is also written using all those cloud technologies, but it doesn't, you couldn't tell it from using it because it looks like a desktop app. And my view is that's where the user interface will ultimately go. And we're not going to be focused on making user interface changes in the next year. So by the time we return to it, I expect we'll have moved on. You won't need a browser to run stuff in the cloud apps on the desktop. And Microsoft is getting into the act. One of the bottom here, I list the Fluent API React Native is Windows 10 using Facebook's JavaScript native API. It's in the early prototype stages, but when we get to 2022, I'm expecting that this kind of stuff will be further along. So what's our overall strategy? We want to get to a single software stack that's maintainable, supportable. That's .NET. So we're focusing on getting the VB6 out of the application. Want to make sure we can integrate with Microsoft Business, which is the rebranded Office 365. Exporting to Excel and importing from Excel and all those other things. But there's also in Azure, if you use 365 and it's cloud-based, you can have additional tools in Azure to do custom workflows and so on for your business. We want to make sure that we play well in that environment so that folks can integrate the application into their business more easily. As we are moving technology into the cloud, like the web API, we're becoming pretty focused on a dedicated desktop and server environment per customer, to where in the web API that SQL database is a SQL database per customer. It makes it eliminates the concerns about sharing data and can somebody else see my data. And the virtualization technology is moving along to the point to where hosting a system that functions much like your current desktop based configuration in the cloud dedicated for a customer is becoming feasible. So that's where we're headed in terms of when we're deploying stuff in the cloud, how we're going to approach it. We're trying to do everything incrementally, so it's driven by need. So we're doing, the setup files we have to do, but we are trying to make sure some properties emerge as we work, that the code becomes more modular, more extensible, and it gets more integrated. An example of that is our SQL database layer. Part of the 11.4 release, there's libraries and stuff. If you look at the files on the disk that have the word JET in them, that's the traditional Microsoft Access database layer. But we have split that out in the .NET code we've been working on so that we have a plug-in replacement that uses SQL Server instead. So our database layer is independent of our other modules, which means we can take code that runs against JET and swap out the module and run it against SQL Server. And that had a nice synergy with what we're doing in the Web API, because we were looking at ways to generate some of the data and respond to some of the types of queries we want to support. And so we're looking at the user-defined report as a way of doing that, and we realized we can separate that out from the Windows Forms interface it currently has, and host it in the web and use the SQL Server database, or move it back to the desktop in its new form and use it there with the WinForms interface. What that lets us do is share the performance improvements in the report, because we're changing the design quite a bit for the web. It's basically a trade-off. In the old VB6 code was written to use very little memory because it was had its origins in the DOS days with small amounts of memory. For .NET, we can do things like read the database and not have to reread it. We can keep the data around. We'll use more memory, but the reports will run faster. And both the desktop and the cloud can benefit from having the same basic internal module for the report. Obviously, the user interface will be different. We're also looking, as I mentioned before, to integrate external modules. So if you want to use Power BI for reporting, we're looking at, and we allow that to be added to the reporting menu so that you can click a button. We're not actually planning that for any release yet, but that's one of the things we're trying to keep in the back of our minds as functionality so that people can plug in the pieces they want to use. And that is that. Are you still out there, Brian? You usually have a comment.
I am here. And I think after maybe the second or third time, it's sticking, Martin. I think I got it. So, yeah, I mean, the only comment I would make is just that, you know, the thing really that has been forefront is to get the platform changed, get the code base changed. And we really don't have that opportunity to do a lot of other things until that happens. And, you know, that's definitely the roadmap. We're right in the middle of it. But until we get to the true .NET environment, which is still, you know, probably 9 months away, let's say, for the main modules in a releasable form, at that point, then we can, and we've talked about, you know, maybe taking a pause and looking at some features that are really going to be the things that our users have been waiting on, that we could potentially release some things that make it quicker and easier to use. But we can't, you know, certainly can't make any of those things now to the old code base, and so we need to get this transition done first.
Yep. Yeah, it's a lot more productive for the developers to be using the current tool set than to use one that's basically 25 years old. So, of course, I trap myself in raising expectations, but it'll be a lot easier for us to troubleshoot problems, for example, once we get the .NET code out there.
Well, this Randy, I think one of the interesting things for me is what come along the learning here is that Mark's telling us we'll have our own virtual servers. And so if you're wondering about where data is going to be residing and who's going to own the data, it's still going to be our own data, and it'll be virtual in the cloud, but it'll still be our data.
Yeah, it'll still be in your system. Yeah. So it's not like you're having to share it on a common platform.
We're taking a different course than a lot of ag software. It's either coming at one extreme's coming at it from a cloud-based system, an ERP that's you're sharing data with other users, and then the other extreme is systems that's very dated and it's not being updated, and it's functional, but it doesn't have a future in it. What we're trying to do is map out something we think is the best route for the end user, and so we appreciate any kind of feedback that you would give us. This is what we're doing is going to have value to producers.
So one of the things that the board is found or developed, moved on with, this development process, the translation with the third party is coming along quicker than we had anticipated and at a lower cost. And so we're, that all looks good. And then we're also looking at the web API for the MASA users, for those folks who are investing in that there's a real opportunity to be sharing at least data out to begin with, but data in, it's, if I'm saying that right, Martin, in the short term here.
Yep. Yep.
Well, are we leading into the MASA discussion?
Right.
It seems like, and Randy's on the board with myself and Brian. We're on the MASA board. But for those of you who are, long-term FBS users or new potential FBS users, really what Martin just went through, a lot of that is being driven by the dollars that the MASA members have put in to do the migration of the code. That's what Randy was referring to there. We're working with a German company that's doing a lot of the bulk converting and migration from Visual Basic to .NET. And that has really sped up the process. What was looking like might be a 2.5 or 3.5 year process is we're going to start seeing those results by the end of this year. I think it's really pretty critical too that this relationship between FBS and MASA, if you haven't been involved, it's very connected. But I was thinking about a good way to help those of you who aren't really been in on all these conversations in the past, and some of you might be on the call now, would be that as the .NET code comes into use, FBS will be paying a royalty to MASA because the MASA money is driving that conversion. But that is, as time goes on, as we move farther and farther into the .NET code, that transference of some of the revenue generated by FBS will be shared with MASA as a royalty. And then also there's going to be capabilities in the MASA code, being a MASA member in the MASA code, that will never be in the FBS straight up code. But FBS will always be a path into MASA as we currently envision it. So, and Norm, are we ready to start talking about MASA?
Yes, yes.
So, Brian will go into it. I think, Brian, it might be a good time for you to talk a little bit about the API. Martin brought that in. Why are we doing that? If you want to go through that.
Right. So yeah. So when the MASA cooperative was formed and the decision was made to invest in migrating FBS to the new programming language and new platform so that we can roll on into the future, the other thing we decided to try to do in parallel was to begin to address the issue of connectivity to other software programs using an API, which all API is an application programming interface, but it just means the automatic flow of data, so that if you have some sort of other management tool you're using that is software, that it would be possible that the data can flow from there directly into or out of the MASA FBS package. And so we're working, the first step for that, the very first step is to create the infrastructure, obviously the technology, the database that allows for that, because that's obviously an internet-based, cloud-based activity. That's what Martin's been working on alongside this migration plan. And we will soon have the ability to push data up and out and make it available to other programs. And again, it's protected, it's secure, it's only based upon individual users granting permission and all of the things that secure data now. But when we talked as a group, obviously there are a lot of features and things that are important, but connecting to other programs, equipment maintenance programs, and hedge account management programs, and swine production management programs, and crop production management programs, and it's also possible that we will be able to connect to accountants, accounting firms, and even our bankers, where they would be able to directly, and again, obviously it depends upon the relationship and whether you allow it or not, but where they could directly pull financial data, financial statements from the system, and just create this interconnectivity for facilitating obviously the accounting and tax preparation and financial statement preparation, but also the credit decision. So it's creating this connectivity that we thought was really critical. And again, it's a process as well. It will take some time, but we are moving. It's moving along, and we're very excited about where that's going to be with that particular piece, at least the first stage, by the end of this year.
So Randy, you and Brian are leading up the product kind of development. So we had a MASA member meeting yesterday afternoon. So Randy, maybe one of the issues we were talking about there is getting ideas and input from the MASA membership, and then also what we're talking about as far as service and working with Slack and so forth, making sure we get some good communication going to the MASA members.
And Brian really, they talked about ways of submitting requests, and so Brian went through that presentation yesterday afternoon to the MASA members, and maybe Brian best touch base on that, but it's really trying to, there is some opportunity to do some sharing, some of topics that are maybe ways of understanding something that's going on, but also ways of submitting. And so I know Martin would really rather not have us get into too much detail about submitting, because he likes to, there needs to be a level of choice on their part about what is support and what is feature submission. But the challenge really here is as we work through, yeah, we still got some number of months where the translation's still happening. So we want to be able to develop lists of feature things that want to be implemented, but we still have to give the programmers time to get the translation done. And we're still looking at the end of December for third party to even complete that. So we've got a few months before we can really bear down on implementing features, but we want to be able to get them in the pipeline and get them prioritized, and really want to have all the folks have opportunity to do that.
But we are looking to build out the MASA membership, and we, I think Joe's left us, but one of the conversations we've been having is what we have really realized with the MASA group, and you heard from Randy and Joe and Brian earlier today, is that the MASA group has developed as a really powerful technology group, peer group, and the ability to share and build off of each other's experiences. And right now we're glad to share that with the FBS community at large, but that's also a real advantage to being a MASA member, is this connection. We also heard yesterday from Robert Lubin, who is the head of technology development, digital for Rabobank. And I don't know if you all know who Rabo is. I guess most of you do, but they're probably the largest straight agricultural bank, financial institution in the world, based out of the Netherlands, and they have a presence in the U.S. And of course, they're not that large in the U.S. comparison to, say, Farm Credits and so forth, but there's still quite a presence. They had just completed this last year a pretty extensive review of financial databases, financial systems, technology throughout the world, Australia, New Zealand, South America, Europe. And so he has actually been talking with the MASA group fairly often, and they really are very supportive of where we're headed. One of the big takeaways that we have picked up from those conversations is there's a lot of, kind of two levels: the kind of traditional ag systems that are available in the States. Most of them are not receiving the kind of new investment that it takes to bring them up, to bring that code up to the modern level, and that's really what MASA is doing, and that's his whole movement to .NET. And without that, eventually those existing systems are going to struggle because they're not going to be able to adapt to the cloud. And so that's what MASA is trying to get on top of, the ability to do that. In addition to that, too, though, as Brian identified, we really are looking at this API, at these conversations, and the MASA board has had a number of conversations with other suppliers of technology like CIH and MetaFarms and so forth. And again, the goal of the board is to be interactive with these other players, to have our financial data flow on our control into those systems that we want them to go into, and then also to be able to get data out of those systems back into our database for all of us to make better decisions with. To that end, though, I still would encourage you, if you're at all interested in becoming a MASA member and would like to get more details, please reach out to Norm or myself or any of the board members and let us know, and we'd be glad to have a conversation with you.
Yeah, and I would just echo that too. You've heard us talk about a meeting that happened yesterday. That was the annual MASA meeting, and just really make sure that everyone's welcome, invited to be an owner, a participator in that opportunity, and just like John said, reach out to Norm or one of the board members and visit about that. We'd be tickled to talk with you.
Norm, you wanted to discuss the slide there, or I see you brought that up?
Well, we just got, here's some of the API discussions we've had and companies that are open to sharing. And one of the reasons we did some surveys, what people are using, and sometimes we find that there's a lot of commonality. They're using a third-party product, and there's some real benefits of focusing on our development that connect with that through the API. Here's the current user base in MASA. They all have come from FBS customers, and who wanted to go to the next step, and quite a few of them were involved either yesterday or today in the meeting. We'll be following up with more information updates on this process. Does anyone have anything else they want to add before we close off the session today? We appreciate everyone's flexibility and patience in the technology.